Matthew, also called Levi, was a Jewish tax collector when he became a follower of Jesus. That means he was almost certainly rich, highly educated, and hated by his Jewish brethren. You see, tax collectors were considered traitors to their own people. And yet Jesus saw something in him. And Jesus called him to become one of his closest disciples. And eventually Jesus called him to write down the good news message of Jesus so that it could be spread to the very people whom he had betrayed. Matthew's account is so well organized and so amazingly crafted. It's broken down into many sections, which I will be going over in this video. And my hope is that once you've seen the gospel according to Matthew in its entirety, you'll be amazed just by how well put together it is. But my other hope is that you'll notice how unique it is when comparing it to the other gospel accounts. So what that means is that I'm going to be sharing certain texts, certain scriptures will be coming up on the screen. And I want you to understand here at the offset that those texts which will be appearing on the screen, almost every one of them are scriptures that can only be found in Matthew. We're going to be showing you texts that are unique to this gospel account. So just keep that in mind as I go through the structure of the gospel according to Matthew. Let's go ahead and dive right in. The book of Matthew starts off with a prologue of sorts in chapters 1 and 2. And it's very similar to the beginning of the Gospel of Luke in that it deals with Jesus' birth and the nativity stories. And yet it's also very different from that account. In fact, almost every verse of these two chapters is completely unique to Matthew. Because yes, he tells somewhat the same story as Luke, but he tells it from the perspective of Joseph. That seems to be the perspective he's writing from. But instead of diving straight into the story of Jesus' birth, he starts off in a very Jewish way. He starts off with a genealogy, a family tree of sorts through the line of Joseph, showing here at the very beginning of the book that Jesus is, 1, a son of Abraham, 2, a son of David, meaning he's literally royalty. He's descended from a king, which this would not have gone under the radar of any Jewish person reading the book at the time, because they understood the Messiah was a son of David. It also shows a connection between Jesus and the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Because in the very beginning of the Bible, the book of Genesis, it starts off with genealogies. Genesis is in many ways a book of genealogies. So Matthew is right off the bat drawing a connection between Jesus and the Old Testament, specifically the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, the books of law. Now, this whole prologue continues to prove that point. He tells the story of Jesus' birth and of Jesus having to go on the run from King Herod. And as he tells this story, Matthew continually quotes from Old Testament prophets. And his point is that everything that happened in the early years of Jesus' life, all of it was predestined to occur. In other words, it wasn't by accident. And so Matthew quotes from prophets who spoke of Jesus being born of a virgin, of Jesus being born in Bethlehem, of Jesus having to go on the run to Egypt because King Herod was threatened by him. Which, by the way, this idea of a Jewish ruler going after Jesus, it's another piece of connective tissue with the Torah and with Moses specifically. Because Moses, when he was an infant, was threatened by a tyrant king who, in order to assert his power, went and slaughtered countless male children. In the same way, Jesus' very life was threatened by a tyrant king who slaughtered male children of a certain age in Bethlehem. So we're meant to see the connections here between Jesus and the Torah, Jesus and Moses. And yet there's an ironic twist because Jesus is being threatened by a Jewish leader, not an Egyptian pharaoh. And I think that's an important distinction which will come again as we continue to look at this book. We go into the next section of Matthew. After we've witnessed the prologue, the birth of Jesus, we go into 5 main sections between the prologue and the climax. And each of these sections, again, is expertly organized. They each start off with a block of stories and then lead into a sermon or a discourse. There are 5 of these discourses in the Gospel of Matthew. And again, this parallels the 5 books of Moses, the 5 books of the Torah. The idea here is that Jesus is a master teacher like Moses, and yet better. And so what we see here are 5 distinct sermons, each of them ending with the same phrase, or at least close to the same phrase. And that is, when Jesus had finished saying these things. By using this combination of words, Matthew actually helps us break his book into sections. Now, beginning in section 1 here, after the prologue, we have chapters 3 through 7. And in chapters 3 and 4, we have a block of stories where Jesus is reintroduced now as an adult, and he's beginning his ministry. But before he really begins to teach and preach, he has to go to John the Baptist to be baptized. And John the Baptist tells him, "No, you should be baptizing me." But Jesus says, "Permit it to be done to fulfill all righteousness." The word fulfill is very important and is repeated several times throughout this account, mostly referring to Jesus fulfilling Old Testament prophecy. But Jesus uses this word as well in a couple of important places, and we'll see one of them in just a moment. After Jesus is baptized, he's whisked away by the Holy Spirit into the wilderness where he is tested for 40 days. And again, we're meant to notice a connection here between Jesus and Moses. Just as Moses and the people of Israel passed through the waters of the Red Sea into the wilderness for 40 years, Jesus has passed through the waters of baptism and has gone into the wilderness to be tested for 40 days. The big difference, of course, is that Jesus passes the test, whereas the people of Israel didn't really. After Jesus is in the wilderness being tested, he returns to Galilee, where he begins to preach and perform miracles. But Matthew doesn't linger on any one miracle or any one story at this point in time. He wants to go straight into the most famous sermon in all the Bible, the Sermon on the Mount. And I think the idea here is that before we can be shown the power that Jesus has, Matthew wants to start off by showing us his teaching. This is a very important part of Matthew, the teaching of Jesus. And so Jesus begins this amazing Sermon on the Mount in chapters 5 through 7. And it's in the midst of this sermon, in chapter 5, verses 17 through 20, that Jesus reassures his audience. Jesus says, "Do not presume that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill." A lot of the times when we read the Sermon on the Mount, we look at it like a group of proverbs, and we forget that they connect with one another to form a grand overarching point. And I believe that point is beautifully stated in these verses, where Jesus starts off by saying, "Don't worry, I came to fulfill the law and prophets, not abolish." He also says in verse 20, "Unless your righteousness far surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." What's really cool about the Sermon on the Mount is that, yes, it is the first of 5 main discourses, but it also introduces some of the important themes in the Gospel of Matthew as a whole. And theme number 1, which we've already been seeing in the prologue and the following stories, that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law of Moses, the Torah, and the whole Hebrew Bible. But the second important theme that is introduced here in the Sermon on the Mount, and will become a recurring theme throughout the book, is that this gospel account is a scathing indictment toward the Jewish leaders who rejected Jesus. Specifically the scribes and the Pharisees. This gospel account is the harshest toward that group of people than any of the other gospel accounts. It is a scathing condemnation, a judgment written upon them, upon really any Jewish person who rejects Jesus as the Messiah, but especially those who have power over the people and do so. And so the Sermon on the Mount actually shows us just how bad things got under the leadership of the scribes and Pharisees. Jesus uses this sermon to point out that the scribes and Pharisees had robbed the law of its meaning, of its motive, that they were playing pretend, they were hypocrites. They pretended to follow the law of Moses, and yet they really weren't. They weren't being salt and light like the people of God should be. And it's after these amazing words that the people who were listening say, wow, this guy preaches with authority. And they marveled at him because of that authority. And Matthew skillfully uses this idea that Jesus preached with authority to transition into the next section of stories, which we'll call the authority of the king. In these next stories, chapters 8 and 9, we're shown just how much authority Jesus has through many stories of miracles. We're shown that Jesus has authority over disease through various healing accounts. We're shown that Jesus has authority over nature itself when he calmed the storm on the Sea of Galilee. We're also shown that Jesus has authority over demonic forces by casting out demons. We're even shown that Jesus has authority over time and space itself. It's this really cool story where Jesus talks to a Roman centurion, and this is a non-Jewish person, and yet this non-Jewish person recognizes the type of authority that Jesus has. It's this really amazing moment where Jesus heals someone from far away. He has authority even over time and space. Now, as you can imagine, in this section of stories, Jesus says he's just preached a scathing condemnation against the Jewish leaders. As you can imagine, in the midst of these stories, there is a conflict beginning to arise between Jesus and the religious leaders. And there's a moment in chapter 9 where Jesus actually gives them a chance to change their ways. It's found in chapter 9, verses 12 through 13, where Jesus, speaking to the scribes and Pharisees, says this: "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire compassion rather than sacrifice." And this whole issue, conflict that started between them, it started with Matthew himself. Jesus chose Matthew, a tax collector, to be his follower. And the people, the religious leaders, did not like that at all. They had no time for a one such as Matthew. They had no mercy for someone like that. And Jesus tells them, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. You better believe the religious leaders thought of themselves as healthy. But Jesus says, you need to go and you need to learn what compassion really looks like. Jesus tells them to go and learn what compassion means. He's giving the religious leaders one chance. At least that's how Matthew presents it. To go and change their ways. And that phrase, I desire mercy rather than sacrifice, it's going to come back. But just as we're beginning to understand the scope of Jesus' authority, we're shown the second discourse. And it's in this discourse that Jesus brings together 12 men and names them apostles. And he actually gives some of his authority to these men. And he sends them out to heal people of their diseases and to cast out demons and to preach the good news. But as he sends them out, he warns them that they're going to face persecution. And he tells them, don't lose heart, for you will be rewarded. But it's after this sermon that it perfectly transitions into the next section, which is all about the response to the kingdom. As the disciples go out and preach the good news, there's really only two ways that people will respond. They'll either say yes and believe, or no and reject the Word of God. Now, this whole section is about people's response to the kingdom, varied responses. Some people just don't know what to make of Jesus, including his own family and even John the Baptist. Others reject him outright. There are a group of cities which Jesus pronounces woes upon in this section who rejected the gospel message. Of course, the religious leaders also reject him. And it's in this moment, it's in this section that phrase comes back. In chapter 12, verses 5 through 7, we find out that the religious leaders hadn't actually learned what true compassion is. The Pharisees were angry at Jesus and his followers for picking grain on the Sabbath, and Jesus scolds them, and he tells them, if you had known what this means, if you had learned what it means, I desire compassion rather than sacrifice, then you would not have condemned the innocent. Jesus tells them that they had their chance to learn compassion, but they blew it. And it's after this conflict that Matthew tells us the Pharisees and scribes went off to plot against Jesus how they might destroy him. You see, this is a change. This marks a pivotal moment in the gospel according to Matthew, where a fuse is lit and it continues to burn throughout the rest of the gospel until it explodes in the climax, where this conflict burns brighter and brighter until eventually the two sides, Jesus and the religious leaders, come to an explosive finale. Now, it's after these stories that all have to deal with the response to the kingdom that we get into the third of the discourses. And these discourses are very much about people's response to the kingdom of heaven. Jesus tells parables concerning the kingdom of heaven. Now, all of these parables are obviously giving us details into the inner workings of the kingdom. We're told that the people of God are planted in the kingdom, but that there are also people planted among the kingdom as enemies or weeds, planted by the enemy himself, Satan. But it's in these parables that we're told the kingdom of heaven is extremely valuable, and yet not everyone sees it that way. After the third discourse, we lead into this fourth section here, which I will call lack of faith in the kingdom. Jesus, in these chapters, begins to withdraw from the people. He was withdrawing from crowds. He's trying to be alone by himself or with his disciples. It's a really sad section of the book for Jesus because his own family rejects him, his own hometown. Also, John the Baptist is beheaded. And so we see Jesus, he seems to become more introverted, where he just wants to be by himself, and yet the people keep following him so that he can't be. In fact, so many people follow him that he eventually feeds 5,000 of them and later 4,000 of them. But it's after he feeds the 5,000 that he sends the disciples off in a boat across the Sea of Galilee, and he goes up onto a mountainside to pray by himself. But it's that night he begins walking by them on the water. Now, we all know the story of Jesus walking on the water, right? But did you know that it's only in the Gospel of Matthew that we're told Peter's part of the story? In this moment, when Jesus is walking by the boat, he says, "Do not fear, it is I." And Peter says to him, "Lord, if it really is you, tell me to come out on the water with you." And Jesus says, "Come." And so Peter gets out of the boat, starts walking on the water, and yet he becomes afraid. He starts seeing the rain and the waves, and he begins to sink. And he cries out to Jesus. Now Jesus gets there and pulls him out and saves him. But look at what Jesus says. He says, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" This seems to be the main theme of this section. In this section, Jesus is dealing with lack of faith on all sides. There are some triumphant moments, to be sure. There's the Mount of Transfiguration, where Jesus is transformed before the eyes of Peter, James, and John, and is found to be standing next to Moses and Elijah. But immediately after this, as they're going down the mountain, they find out that the rest of the disciples have been attempting to cast out a demon from a little boy, but they've been unable to do it. And they ask Jesus why, and he tells them it's because of their meager faith. Now, even though this story can be found in other gospel accounts, it's only in Matthew's that we're told they couldn't do it because of their lack of faith. And that's what this section is all about, lack of faith in the kingdom. Now, there's a little interesting section right before the fourth discourse where Jesus deals with taxes, which would have been very important to Matthew's Jewish audience. But it's after that that we get into the fourth discourse, which is all about rank in the kingdom. And Jesus preaches something which by human standards sound backwards. Jesus says if you want to be first in the kingdom, you should be last. Jesus preaches humility. He preaches grace to those who harm you and helping those in need. This is what this sermon is all about. And it's after this sermon that we get into the penultimate section of Matthew, the fifth section here in the middle, which we call the clash of the kingdoms. It's fight night. We have Jesus and the kingdom of heaven in one corner, and we have the religious leaders and really the kingdom of this world ruled by Satan himself in the other corner. And these two kingdoms are coming to war, coming to blows with one another. Jesus turns to Jerusalem and begins making his way there, but the conflict really begins when Jesus enters Jerusalem. We have the triumphal entry, which Matthew makes a point to remind us is a fulfillment of the Old Testament. But then as soon as Jesus enters the city, he goes to the temple and he cleanses it. He kicks people out of it. He creates a whip and strikes at people, making them leave. He overturns tables. Jesus begins a mighty conflict which takes place throughout the last week of his life. And a lot of the sparring that takes place is verbal. We have discussions taking place between Jesus and the religious leaders, and they're trying to test him. And Jesus, he's very, very harsh toward them. In chapter 21, that tax collectors and sinners will enter the kingdom of heaven before them. Jesus is very harsh toward them. And there are several passages in this section which are unique to Matthew, and almost every single one of them is extremely harsh to the religious leaders. Now, the religious leaders try to test Jesus in various ways. They ask him about taxes, and they ask him about the resurrection, and they ask him about the greatest commandment. And Jesus, of course, being Jesus, passes all of these tests with flying colors. He knocks them all out of the park. And then he decides to lay down condemnation upon them. And I would call this a culminating moment in the book of Matthew. In Matthew chapter 23, we're shown the woes that Jesus gives to the Pharisees and scribes. And it's in these woes, most of them being unique to Matthew. In fact, there are only a couple that can be found throughout the Gospel of Luke. But almost all of chapter 23 is unique to Matthew, and it is probably the harshest collection of words we have from Jesus. We don't have time to read all of that chapter, but here are a few highlights. Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness." Now, these words lead us into the fifth and final discourse, which is all about judgment in the kingdom. And it's in these words, which have been debated over the years, that Jesus actually talks about a judgment which will be coming upon the people of Israel, the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. But Jesus uses this temple destruction to show a glimpse of eternal judgment, which will come upon the whole world. And then he tells three unique parables. The first is the parable of the 10 virgins. And the point of that parable is that we need to be waiting and watching for the final judgment day, because we don't know when it's going to come. And then the second parable is the parable of the talents, where Jesus tells us that when the master returns, we will be judged on how well we used our opportunities. Now, opportunities for what, you might ask? Well, he answers that question in the third unique parable, which there's some debate on whether or not you want to call it a parable, but in chapter 25, Jesus very frankly gives a picture of the final judgment day, where lined up on each side, we have on the left goats and on the right sheep. And Jesus, then being judge of all the world, speaks to each side. And he tells those on his left that when they didn't show compassion, when they weren't helping the needy, whatever they didn't do for the least of these, they hadn't done for Jesus. In other words, Jesus demands that his followers show compassion to the helpless. It's that same compassion that the Pharisees and scribes failed to learn, which leads us into the climax of Matthew, where, again, all of the conflict explodes. It comes to a head. We see Jesus preparing for the Passover. We see one of the 12, Judas, deciding to betray him for a bag of silver. We see Jesus anointed for his burial, and he actually attends the Passover meal with the 12, and he tells Peter that Peter's going to deny him. All of these events are leading to a climactic moment in the story. And in the Garden of Gethsemane that night, as Jesus is praying, a mob comes to arrest him. And it's in that moment, as he's being arrested, that Jesus says something very important. And remember, these words are only found in Matthew's account. One of the apostles has just taken out a sword, planning to fight for Jesus, but Jesus says, "Put your sword back in its place, for all those who take up the sword will perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? How then would the scriptures be fulfilled, which say that it must happen this way?" Later on, he says again, "All this has taken place that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." Matthew wants us to understand that nothing in this book, nothing that has taken place, especially now that Jesus is being arrested, none of it is by accident. It had all been predestined to occur. Now, Jesus is arrested, and he's brought to trial. In fact, we're shown him brought to Pilate, who was governor of Judea under the Roman Empire. And it's only in Matthew's account that we're shown Pilate wash his hands. Look at what it says in chapter 27, verses 24 through 25. "Now when Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but rather that a riot was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, 'I am innocent of this man's blood. You yourselves shall see.' And all the people replied, 'His blood shall be on us and on our children.'" Now, there are a lot of people who would like to pluck that verse right out of Matthew because it is considered to be offensive to the Jewish people. But I want us to approach this whole book as if we're a first century Jewish person. When we read through the Gospel of Matthew as a first century Jewish person, we are meant to feel uncomfortable. We are meant to be challenged in all of our preconceived notions and ideas. And above all, we are meant to come to the conclusion that without Jesus, we are hopelessly condemned. Now, as the story continues, Jesus is taken to Golgotha and executed on a cross. It's a powerfully sad moment, but it's also a triumphant moment. for the astute reader who's been reading through the Gospel of Matthew understands by this point that it had always been meant to be. That none of this was an accident. Yes, the religious leaders and Satan, who was operating in the shadows behind them, thought that they had won by putting Jesus to death. But in reality, they were only playing into Jesus' plan. And so Jesus is taken from the cross and buried in a tomb. And then on the third day, the tomb is found empty. Now, there are a few details surrounding this story that are unique to Matthew. It's only in Matthew's account that we're told kind of the viewpoint of the religious leaders. Even before Jesus is raised from the dead, we're told in Matthew that the religious leaders were afraid his body would be stolen by his disciples. So they actually brought soldiers to the tomb to guard it. But these guards were no match against the power of God. And so angels came down, the rock of the tomb was pushed aside, and the soldiers, they run back to the Jewish leaders, and they tell them what took place. And get this, the hearts of the Jewish leaders were so hardened that they hear about this miraculous event, about the resurrection itself, and even then, instead of believing, they decide to keep fighting. Even then, they decide to concoct a story, which Matthew tells us was still being told to this day. A story that the disciples had stolen Jesus' body. And it's this idea that if you're a first century Jewish reader and you get to this point of the story, you read that line and you think, oh yeah, they are still saying that. They are still saying that Jesus' body was stolen by the disciples. And yet, hopefully at this point, as you're reading, you're coming to a different conclusion. Now, interestingly, the Gospel of Matthew doesn't tell us much about the resurrected Jesus. It doesn't tell us much about what he did with his followers. In fact, it ends with a very profound statement, but not much else. It's this amazing moment where Jesus gives one final commission to his disciples. Jesus says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to follow all that I commanded you. And behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." I want you to imagine for a moment that you are really a first century Jewish person. And you are witnessing the Christian movement as it begins to flourish. And let's say you're skeptical. Let's say their audacious claim that Jesus was raised from the dead is just too audacious for you to accept. And you've been hearing the religious leaders talking about how this is a blasphemous movement. And you've been told by the religious leaders how the disciples stole Jesus' body. And yet, as you're pondering these things, you realize that some things don't add up. That the disciples of Jesus are actually performing miracles. And also that they're willing to die for this movement. Now, if they were really lying and they actually had stolen the body, why would they die? And so as you're pondering all of these things, you're invited to listen to a reading of the Gospel of Matthew. And so you don't think you're going to be convinced by it. You're skeptical, but you agree anyway because it's a friend. And so you go and you listen to the words that Matthew wrote down. And your eyes are slowly and methodically opened to a very profound truth. That Jesus is the one you were waiting for. Because you've been shown the story of Jesus from beginning to end. And you've been shown, meticulously shown, how each and everything Jesus went through and did from his birth all the way down to his death had been spoken of by the prophets of old. You've been shown that Jesus is the son of David, a king. You've been shown that he's a master teacher like Moses, but better than Moses. You have now been forced to come to one very important conclusion. Jesus is the fulfillment. He is the promise that had been made thousands of years before. Jesus is the Messiah. And that's what this gospel account is all about. Matthew very meticulously and passionately proves that Jesus is the one and only Messiah.